This is the third segment. If you don't know what ESGs are, it is a big deal. This is more important than anything I've told you. As much props as I gave Daily Wire and Jeremy Boring, this is concerning. And they can't change that. So they're doing their thing. But this ESG is designed to stop Jeremy Boring. They know that that could happen. It's the same way of trying to control people with a social credit score is to control companies with a social credit score. That's what ESG is. Robbie the Fire Bernstein did the best job. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts, a lot of audiobooks on ESG because I wasn't very knowledgeable. I'm still trying to get there. But he, out of everything I've listened to, he touched on things that not many other people touched. And he talks about it just like a normal person, so it's easier to digest. And this is my opinion. There's not all, ESGs are not all bad, but there's the big problem with them. It's a corporate social credit system used to disguise an illegal racketeering scheme run by our government and big business. It's a strong statement, but I feel comfortable enough saying that I believe that's what it is. Let me play this clip here. Let me know if the audio works.
Then they started talking about, well, we're going to add this. Then they started talking about, well, we're going to add this new thing where it's not just about inflation, balancing inflation with employment, but we're also going to add to the charter. I don't have the exact language on this, but it was something to do with essentially making sure that minorities are getting ahead within our economy, right? So it's not good enough for the Fed to step in and regulate the markets in a way that's going to balance inflation and employment. We also need to make sure that they're balancing that minorities are seeing the same economic opportunities as others. Now, how the Fed could possibly do the economy, right? So it's not good enough for the Fed to step in and regulate the markets in a way that's going to balance inflation and employment. We also need to make sure that they're balancing that minorities are seeing the same economic opportunities as others. Now, how the Fed could possibly do this, beyond me. Then all of a sudden you start reading about...
Sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute there. Another mute moment. What I'm talking about here is when you talk about the federal government, I'll reset this just real quickly since I was on mute. The Treasury Department has determined that it is in the public interest to establish the Treasury Advisory Committee on Racial Equity. So why is the government getting into racial equity? Anything that is arbitrary and is an opinion has to be scary because we don't agree on all this stuff. So why is the Treasury Department getting into a realm that is completely, they should be dealing with percentages and numbers and facts. They should be dealing with nothing other than money up to the decimal point of pennies or even fractions of pennies. This should have nothing to do with the Treasury. Racial equity. This is stemmed from an executive order from Joe Biden. It's where this is coming from.
That minorities are getting ahead within our economy, right? So it's not good enough for the Fed to step in and regulate the markets in a way that's going to balance inflation and employment. We also need to make sure that they're balancing that minorities are seeing the same economic opportunities as others. Now, how the Fed could possibly do this, beyond me.
That is God. Remember, I've done segments where I say they believe government is God. How the hell is the government going to ensure racial equity, and we don't even know what racial equity is? We don't even know what that means. It's almost like saying it's almost like the climate change argument. Whether you believe in it or not is irrelevant. How does the government solve that? Like, you're not God. You can't just solve things with the government.
Then all of a sudden you start reading about, just generally speaking, this thing called ESG scores. ESG scores are, it's like a regulatory compliance that, like, let's say you're ExxonMobil, right? So if you're ExxonMobil, you have to report on, hey, am I promoting women? Am I promoting minorities? Am I investing in green energy? And a lot of things that you and I would look at and go, wait a second, like, this seems like a very leftist agenda, right? But now all of a sudden you're somewhat responsible. It's not that you're responsible. It's that companies like BlackRock, which is the biggest investor on Wall Street, they're responsible for $9 trillion a year. will say, hey, we are going to basically divest, or we're not going here. Like, we're looking for things that have high ESG scores. What's ESG scores? All of these regulations in a market that's free, the only way you make money is if you're handing people value. If a regulation comes in that allows you to make money without providing something of value, there's a massive amount of theft, which would result in a transfer of wealth, essentially from your poorest people who all need to buy energy on a daily basis into the hands of the big banks and the people that can actually control the regulatory environment to make these fucking windmills and other bullshit profitable. There you go. That's the scoop on ESG.
And so it covers a lot: environment, social, governance. So I'm just going to talk about it from this standpoint. If you listen to Eric July, or if you just in the news and you see, why are there all these race, gender, sexual preference swaps for establishment characters and openly racist programming? And I'm not against representation. I mean, you can do original characters. You definitely would never swap historical characters unless you're doing some type of weird what if. And Marvel, I believe, has done that to make the excuse of what if this, what if that. But they've even swapped historical characters, race. That makes no sense. These projects almost always fail because no one is asking or craving for it. That's what Robbie was talking about, where why are companies, that's what really triggered me, was why would companies be pushing something that clearly nobody wants? Then when they promote these things, they have to turn the comments off on YouTube because everyone's just downvoting it. And I don't think it's bots. Why would you need to force something that people really, not only do they not want, they hate? Why would you do that? And in a free market, you would never do that. Free markets don't produce goods there's no demand for. So how is that happening? How are they getting funded? And I talked about racist trash. So I talked about this Everything's Gonna Be All White show on Showtime. One of the most disgusting pieces of program I've seen in quite a while. Openly racist program. Like, proud to be racist. Anti-Trump, of course. Anti-MAGA, of course. So racist trash like this keeps getting produced. This is the social part, not the whole social part. Because Robbie talked about, well, we'll say, hey, we're hiring minorities in this, or women in this, and that's not all bad. But let me just talk about this piece here, because this is the part that is cracking society and will threaten Jeremy Boring's idea. So what happens is, so let me talk about this first, and I'll tell you where the money's coming. Notice how diversity, equity, and inclusion never includes people who speak out in criticism of the establishment political viewpoints. How can diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's not how every company uses it, I'm just saying in general, like Showtime doesn't have any pro-MAGA programming. It never includes, like, Candace Owens is black, she could be in whatever identitarian black woman celebration. No, they don't do that. It never includes people who speak outside establishment political viewpoints. That's not diversity. That's not inclusion. So ESG compliance is typically anti-Trump. So let me get more into the ESG. Let's start with BlackRock. BlackRock is just a big investment asset management firm. So BlackRock has more than $10 trillion in assets. And BlackRock is not the only one out there. There's a ton of them. I'm just using them because they're one of the biggest. I think they are the biggest. So BlackRock makes it known they will use this subjective business credit score called the ESG to decide who gets their money. So stop me if I'm wrong on any of this. This is from the BlackRock website, so don't take my word for it. Literally from their website, it says ESG integration is the practice of incorporating ESG information into investment decisions to help enhance risk-adjusted returns. So that's a funny, fancy, goofy way of saying you now, if you want money from us, it will help you to get, or you probably will need to do an ESG report to us and sell to us basically how you're good for the environment, which is a hustle, good socially, which is opinion, a hustle, and good with governance. It's basically a ranking of how obedient you are as a company. So Daily Wire is not going to get a high ESG score. So they're not going to get BlackRock money. I don't know that for a fact because they're not publicly traded to my knowledge. But when you look at publicly traded companies, I do have facts. I do have receipts. So for example, Showtime is the one that put on that everything's going to be all white. Why do you think that kind of garbage goes on TV? Showtime is owned by, it was Viacom CBS, now it's the same company but changed the name to Paramount Global. Paramount Global participates voluntarily. There's no government in this other than, I'll show the relationship between government and BlackRock. But there's no, we're not voting on the ESG. You have no representation on what the ESG is. So this is a completely globalist, anti-constitutional type of act where somebody else is deciding what's good for our environment, what's good for us socially, what's good for us in governance without the say of taxpayers. Already you know that's a hustle. Already you know that's a way to take power away from you and I. So they voluntarily subscribe to this ESG. Why? Because BlackRock won't give them money if they don't, in my opinion. I don't know that for a fact. But I have enough information to say, look at this. Institutions like BlackRock are investing billions into Paramount Global. They are expecting ESG compliance. So Paramount on their website, go to pretty much any big company, they're going to have an ESG report now. Netflix, all of them. Paramount's like, we're good with ESG. This is a hustle. This is a side note to BlackRock. You can invest with us. You look at their shareholders, the largest shareholders, I circled some of them. They're institutions just like BlackRock. BlackRock specifically holds 6.88% of Paramount. That's $1.65 billion. That's just one asset management. Vanguard, $2.4 billion. State Street, $1.2. They all subscribe to ESG. So you see why we have no control over things anymore. You see why Disney has, this woke, stuff going on with them. They're not answering to you. They're not even answering to the free market demands because that's where their money is, the shareholders. So their project might fail, but they still get broke off by these institutions because for their obedience. That's how it's happening. So BlackRock has gotten bailed out. This is now I linked BlackRock to Paramount as an example. Now, how's the government playing this? BlackRock has gotten bailed out and will continue to get bailed out by taxpayers to cover for huge losses in this fascistic, people have been throwing out the word fascism and it just doesn't mean anything anymore. This is fascism. It's a non-free market system. So everything from mortgage-backed securities, bad environmental policies. When I say mortgage-backed securities, I'm talking about even like the crash in '08. So BlackRock came up like really big time after that. So these bad mortgages that they're writing, they knew it was going to crash and they knew they had to get bailed out. So they know that this ESG is not going to always produce revenue. So the government, you and I, even though we have no say in the ESG, we're bailing out the company that's enforcing. Think of BlackRock as the ESG police. They get broken off, they get bailed out by us because their projects will fail and lose money. BlackRock got a bailout with no debate in Congress, no penalty interest rate, the sort imposed on states and cities borrowing the Fed's municipal liquidity facility. No complicated paperwork or waiting in line. No strings attached. It just got bailed out. And you know what really broke them off? Recently, who's going to let a good crisis go to waste? Go take a look at what's in the CARES Act. They got bailed out under the guise of the pandemic. We know what happened in '08 under Obama. This happened under Trump. They used the pandemic to infuse this stuff. And we know where the pandemic stuff is going right now. It's not a good place. CDC, Rochelle Walensky sounding legalish, backtracking, fixing statistics. It was all That's why people call it. I'm not going to call it YouTube. I believe whatever you say, whatever my overlords have to say. I'm just saying that's why other people call it the scamdemic. So if you hear someone call it the scamdemic, I'm not calling it the scamdemic, YouTube. I'm telling you why other people did. It's for those reasons. Because it was a real thing. Companies get high ESG scores for producing things that don't provide value. This is only a small part of it. BlackRock rewards the obedience of these companies with investments. All the middlemen, that's everyone, including your low-level employees all the way up to CEOs. But let's just talk about like everything's going to be all white. CEOs, producers, actors, they all get their cut. If you don't subscribe to this, you're like, what's his name? James Wood. You're like ostracized. You're like Gina Carano. You got kicked out. So all the middlemen have to agree with this stuff. Why do you think all the Hollywood people are going woke? That's why. You have to. You don't have a choice or you're not going to be in that industry. When the money runs out, and it will run out because this is not a free market. They're not producing anything people want. BlackRock gets bailed out and they will get bailed out again because they're considered too big to fail. Let me play this clip right here.
For the Fed to step in and regulate the markets in a way that's going to balance inflation and employment, we also need to make sure that they're balancing that minorities are seeing the same economic opportunities as others. Now, how the Fed could possibly do this, beyond me. But then to also institute that the Fed needs to make sure that there is some level of equality, right? I mean, that's like a whole different degree of socialism. That's not anything that we're voting on. It's just something that's going to go into the Fed's charter. Then the Fed did this weird thing during the last year, which I talked about with the special purpose vehicles, where basically they gave money over to BlackRock. So like a couple years ago, if you remember, I'm going on a tirade here. So if you want to stop me at any point, you can. But essentially, like back in the day, it used to be, you talked about Paulson and Paulson's relationship with places like Goldman Sachs. And you go, there's this revolving door in government between certain financial firms and the Treasury and the Fed. And it's very clear that these people are basically giving the bailouts to the companies that they worked for. So now within the Biden administration, like I think the people in these positions are actually coming from BlackRock. BlackRock is the most powerful player. And BlackRock has this relationship with the Fed that when the Fed was doing these bailouts last year, they gave the money to BlackRock to process it. And they even gave money to BlackRock to process through these special purpose vehicles that were buying bonds, essentially bailing them out. So just to recap here, we've got the Fed expanding into like full on socialism by saying that they are going to be invested in essentially equality. And then we also have this tight relationship between the Fed and BlackRock, where BlackRock is literally handed money from the Fed to go purchase things that the Fed's not allowed to purchase, which essentially acts as a bailout on junk bonds. All right. So we got relationship between BlackRock and the Fed's instituting socialism.
Great explanation there by Robbie. And I'm going to end with this. Sorry if it's abrupt. I have a hard out. But so the way they explain it is everything. And it's no different than Black Lives Matter or the Democrat Party's history all the way up until now to use dead black people as a guise for their power, for them to rise in power. So what they're doing is they're explaining ESG as something beneficial. If they explained ESG as a racketeering scheme, common citizens would be outraged. Instead, they explain it as something beneficial to the climate and to oppressed groups, and we cheer the burglars as they pickpocket us. So at the end, I'm feeling really good. I'm pumped. The reason why I was pumped to do this live was because of Daily Wire and what they're trying to do. They're leading the way right now. I don't know if they literally have their own production studios, but they're doing their own movies. It's probably why they're able to do such a good ad, and I wanted to help promote that ad too. So overall, I feel good, but I'm not going to sugarcoat everything. I don't know what the answer is. Probably who we vote, making sure our politicians. What politicians have you ever heard talk about ESG? I listen to a lot of political stuff. I haven't heard much discussion about this. So my takeaway is We don't have the luxury of being, damn, I got to go to work. Damn, I got to do this, and not contributing anything to make change. If that's the case, then you're worthless in this battle. You're a zombie. My only concern is that the other side doesn't convert you. You're worthless. It doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be online, but we have to make sure this ESG thing, this racketeering scheme has to stop. This goes along the lines of digital freedom and tech and all that. And we can make it stop. We just have to share it with somebody, tell somebody about it. Maybe that's how we'll formulate what's really going on, and we can make change. So I'm out. Thanks a lot, everybody. Let me know what you think. I appreciate it.